In 1973, during the final scene of The Way We Were, director Sydney Pollack walked in and saw the unthinkable. Robert Redford and Barbra Streisand were crying for real. One whispered six-word sentence had shattered them both. Barbra froze, then asked, "Who is Scott?" That single question opened the door to a 14-year secret Redford had never spoken aloud. In 1973, Robert Redford looked like the kind of man nothing could touch. The kind of man life favored. The kind of man built from sunlight. Hollywood loved this image. Those perfect features, that calm voice, the effortless charm that made interviewers lean forward as if he carried some secret they wanted to borrow. Magazine covers called him the golden face of American cinema, the untouchable one, the perfect leading man. To the public, he was a natural miracle, a man who never seemed shaken, never out of control, never undone. But anyone who watched closely, very closely, could see something else. A faint tension in the jaw, a distance in the eyes, a subtle hesitation right before he spoke, as if he were weighing not what to say, but what not to reveal. Redford had mastered the art of appearing whole, while quietly holding the pieces together from the inside. By the time The Way We Were entered pre-production, Redford's star power was so enormous that studios built their schedules around him. Every director wanted him. Every producer wanted him. Everyone assumed he wanted nothing, needed nothing, feared nothing. But fame is a bright light, and bright lights cast deep shadows. Sydney Pollack, who had known Redford for years, sensed them. He saw how Redford sometimes drifted off in the middle of a conversation, as if pulled into an inner room no one else could enter. Pollack never asked. Redford never volunteered. But a director's intuition is sharp. Pollack felt the weight Redford carried, even if he didn't know its name. Then there was Barbra Streisand. Barbra was a storm of her own making, brilliant, forceful, with an artistic instinct so sharp it frightened the unprepared. Nothing about her was passive. She questioned everything, challenged every line, demanded emotional truth in every moment. When she entered a room, the air changed. Not because she tried to dominate it, but because intensity radiated from her like heat. Her way of working was the opposite of Redford's. He hid. She confronted. He kept his heart behind a locked door. She kept hers at the front of the stage. From the moment rehearsals began, the tension between them was undeniable. Not hostile, not romantic, something stranger. Something that startled even them. Pollack later called it dangerous chemistry, the kind that could either elevate a film into greatness or tear it apart from the inside. In early table reads, Streisand would lean forward, eyes sharp, dissecting the emotional mechanics of a line. Redford sat quietly, listening, absorbing, offering small observations only when necessary. But even in silence, he pushed back, through the way he held himself, the way he resisted stepping into emotional territory he didn't want exposed. Streisand noticed. She noticed everything. During one rehearsal, after Redford delivered a line with his usual calm restraint, Streisand lowered her script, studied him, and said softly, "There's something under that. I can feel it." Redford gave a polite smile, the kind that closed more doors instead of opening them. Pollack watched the exchange, saying nothing. As shooting progressed, their dynamic sharpened. Streisand's emotional openness forced Redford to respond, even when he didn't want to. She pushed him into places he had spent 14 years avoiding. Every time their characters argued, you could feel the real tension beneath the fictional one. Every time they looked at each other, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, resistance, curiosity, fear. The crew felt it, too. On set, whispers circulated. They hit a nerve in each other. It's like watching two forces trying to break through the same wall from opposite sides. Something's going to explode. Yet, there were also moments of startling gentleness. Streisand brushing lint off Redford's lapel before a take. Redford adjusting a prop so Barbra wouldn't slip on the sidewalk. Both of them sharing a quiet laugh when a scene went wrong. Nothing romantic, just two people who, despite the friction, understood each other on some instinctive level neither could explain. But underneath all of this, Redford's exhaustion grew. Fame had stretched him thin. Years of burying emotions had hardened him. And now, working with a woman who refused to perform without truth, he found himself cornered. There was only so long a man could pretend he felt nothing. Slowly, scene by scene, the mask Redford wore began to crack. Not visibly, Not dramatically, but in the small details, the slight tremor in his hand after a take, the way he lingered alone near the lighting rigs, the long silences when Pollock asked if he was all right. Streisand noticed that too. She didn't know his story. She didn't know about January 1959 or the apartment in Venice or the tiny hand that once gripped his finger. But she sensed something dark beneath his calmness, something that vibrated faintly like a wire pulled too tight. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that the role she was pulling him into, the emotional terrain she demanded he explore, was the exact terrain he had spent 14 years running from. And the further they went into the film, the more obvious it became. Sooner or later, something in Redford would have to break. Not because of Barbra, not because of Pollock, but because the truth buried inside him was growing too big to contain. Sometimes, art doesn't just reveal characters. Sometimes, it reveals the people playing them. And in the bright light of 1973, Robert Redford's shadows were finally beginning to move. Before Robert Redford became a Hollywood icon, before the magazine covers and the calm, measured interviews, there was a 22-year-old young man living in a cramped apartment in Venice, California. No spotlight, no glamour, just two newlyweds trying to pay rent and raise a baby they loved more than anything in the world. Their apartment was so small that opening the front door felt like stepping into every room at once. The sofa springs creaked every time Redford sat down. The kitchen table still held a burn mark from a pot Lola forgot on the stove. And in one corner of the living room stood a simple white wooden crib, the place where their son, Scott Anthony Redford, slept, breathed, dreamed, and became the center of their universe. Scott was born in November 1957, on a cold morning with a weak sun. Redford was trembling so hard that the doctor had to guide his hands when he held the baby for the first time. He never forgot that moment, a tiny weight resting in his arms, so light he feared even breathing too loudly might wake him. The months that followed were the kind only new parents understand. Long nights, sudden cries, mornings where exhaustion and joy lived side by side. But Redford cherished the quiet moments most. He would sit beside the crib in the dark, lifting Scott gently, rocking him while the apartment remained silent except for the soft rhythm of a baby's breath. One night, Scott's tiny fingers wrapped around Redford's thumb, squeezing with surprising strength. Redford smiled, not the polished smile the world would one day see, but the pure, unguarded smile of a man who had just realized he loved something so deeply it frightened him. In the shadows of that small room, he whispered promises. "I'll always be here. I'll teach you everything. I won't let anything happen to you." But life does not bend to human promises. The morning it happened was painfully ordinary. Redford was making coffee. Lola went to check whether Scott had woken up. Then Redford heard her call his name. Not a scream, not a sob, but a thin, broken sound that didn't feel real. "Bob." He ran to the crib. Scott lay still. Too still. Lola shook him gently. No response. Redford placed a hand on the child's chest. No breath. No movement. No noise. Only the silence of a world collapsing. They rushed to the hospital. Doctors delivered a sentence many parents have heard but never understood. Sudden infant death syndrome. No signs. No warnings. No reason. 1 minute, hope. The next, a void. The funeral was quiet. Family cried. Friends tried to comfort Lola, who clung to her mother, unable to stand on her own. But Redford didn't cry. Not once. His face remained composed in a way that unsettled everyone who loved him. People mistook it for strength. It wasn't strength. It was survival. Redford understood instinctively that if he allowed himself to feel even a fraction of that pain, he might never recover. He felt as if grief were a tidal wave waiting to consume him, and he stayed frozen on shore, refusing to let it touch him. So he sealed it away, locked it, buried it as deeply as he could, not because he didn't care, but because caring was unbearable. The months that followed were a fog. Redford worked obsessively, taking any job he could find. Acting classes, odd performances, auditions, bit parts, anything that kept him moving. The faster he ran, the less he had to think. The less he thought, the less he hurt. Lola tried to talk. He withdrew. Friends asked questions. He avoided them. Family reached out. He shut them out. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He was simply broken in a way he didn't know how to explain. And over time, the grief didn't fade. It crystallized. It became a cold, silent presence inside him, immobile, unspoken, unacknowledged. Sometimes, in rare quiet moments, he would remember the feel of Scott's hand wrapped around his thumb. He would remember the warm weight of his son's body against his chest. He would remember the promises whispered in the dark. Then he would stand up, shake it off, and keep moving. Pain doesn't disappear when we ignore it. It waits. By the time 1973 arrived, Redford had spent 14 years building a fortress around himself, made of discipline, success, composure, and an almost frightening level of emotional control. Not even the people closest to him knew he had lost a child. It was a wound he carried alone, a secret grief that shaped every choice he made without ever being spoken aloud. Then came The Way We Were, and Barbra Streisand. Her intuition was dangerous, razor-sharp, unnerving, almost intrusive in its accuracy. She noticed things others didn't. She saw the flicker behind Redford's eyes, the tension beneath the calmness, the way he held himself as if guarding something fragile. And without meaning to, without knowing why, she began pushing him emotionally, through scenes of love, of conflict, of silence. Through the kind of acting that demanded vulnerability, demanded rawness, demanded the very thing Redford had spent 14 years burying. Each day on set, each look, each argument between their characters chipped away at the wall he'd built. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough for something long dormant to begin stirring. He didn't realize it yet. She didn't realize it yet. But the past, that dark, quiet past he'd outrun for more than a decade, was moving toward him again. And soon, in one scene, in one embrace, in one whispered sentence, the wall would shatter. From the day Scott died, Robert Redford never allowed himself to feel pain again, until he met Barbra. When The Way We Were began shooting, Robert Redford was a man accustomed to distance. Distance from chaos, distance from conflict, and especially distance from the parts of himself he didn't want to confront. He acted with precision, control, and an almost mathematical understanding of emotion. Hollywood praised him for it. Directors relied on it. Audiences adored him for it. Barbra Streisand worked differently. She didn't perform emotions. She became them. She moved through scenes with the sharpness of someone who had survived enough in her own life to recognize truth instantly and reject anything less. Her artistry came from a place Redford had long since sealed off. From the very first rehearsal, it was clear the two of them were operating in different emotional climates. Redford's atmosphere was cool, contained, measured. Barbra's was electric, intuitive, overflowing. And somewhere between the cold and the heat, something volatile began to form. Streisand noticed something in Redford that no one else seemed to catch. Not fatigue, not distraction, but a faint tremor in the emotional frequency beneath his performance. A hollowness, a hesitation, a flicker of something unspoken behind his eyes. She couldn't name it, but she felt it, because Barbra always felt things before she understood them. And that made her dangerous, even without meaning to be. Their first real test arrived during what should have been a simple kissing scene. Soft lighting, a gentle breeze created by an off-camera wind machine, the quiet intimacy between Katie and Hubble. Nothing complicated. The kind of moment Redford could normally execute in 1 or 2 takes. But when he leaned in toward Barbra, his hand shook. Just slightly, but enough for Sidney Pollack, always the observer, to glance up from the monitor. Cut. Reset, he said calmly. Take 2. Redford inhaled too sharply. Take 3. He stepped half an inch too far left. Take 5. His gaze wavered just before his lips reached hers. By take 10, the crew exchanged subtle looks. Something was off. By take 15, Barbra was watching Redford more carefully than the camera was. And by take 17, Pollack knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't the scene. It wasn't nerves. It wasn't Barbra. It was the door, the one Redford had kept locked for 14 years. And Streisand, with her instinct for emotional truth, had walked right up to it without even trying. Each time Redford leaned in for the kiss, his breath changed rhythm. His eyes glistened, not with romance, but with something deeper and heavier. His hands stiffened right before touching her, as though a part of him recoiled from contact, not with her, but with whatever the moment threatened to pull out of him. No one knew the story. No one understood the tremor. But Pollack saw it clearly. He knew about Scott. He knew Redford had spent 14 years acting from the neck up, never letting the heart enter the performance. And he knew Barbra was changing that simply by demanding truth, as she always did. The silent scenes were the hardest. Not the arguments. Not the passion. The silences. In one scene, Katie and Hubble sit across from each other, saying nothing. The camera slowly pushes in. Redford only needs to look at her, steady, calm, unreadable. But the closer the lens moved toward his eyes, the more something fragile began to tremble beneath the surface. A memory. A shadow. A grief he refused to acknowledge. Pollock paused before calling cut, as if giving Redford a chance to choose whether to hold it together or let it slip through. Redford held, but barely. At lunch, he spoke even less than usual. He sat apart from the crew, hands clasped, opening and closing them slowly as if checking which parts of himself were still under control. Barbra approached once, ready to ask if he was all right. He gave her a polite smile, that quiet wall of his, and said, "I'm fine." A simple phrase, delivered too swiftly to be true. Pollock didn't push either. He simply watched, knowing the way a storm watches the sky. The truth was simple, yet impossible for Redford to admit. The film was demanding a kind of honesty he had spent most of his adult life running from. Hubble's vulnerability was threatening to unlock Redford's own. And Streisand, without knowing anything about his past, kept hitting the fault line in scene after scene. In the confrontation scenes, her rawness shook him. In the tender scenes, her sincerity cornered him. In the quiet scenes, her presence left him nowhere to hide. She wasn't breaking him. The role wasn't breaking him. The past was breaking through. And though Redford never said a word to her about what he carried, Barbra felt the weight each time she looked into his eyes. Something inside her whispered that this man was not acting distance. He was living it, guarding it, protecting it from being seen. Yet the camera sees what the soul tries to hide. And Pollock, who had worked with Redford long enough to read the signs, recognized that every day on set was thinning the emotional armor Redford had spent 14 years perfecting. By mid-production, the atmosphere around the two stars had shifted. The crew felt it. Scenes between them became too real, too charged, too honest. They captured moments that didn't feel like performance at all, moments that seemed to belong to two human beings struggling with something larger than the script. But no one dared speak it aloud, because everyone sensed that Redford was approaching an edge, that something behind his eyes was swelling, slowly, silently, inevitably, that there was a point past which he would not be able to hold everything together. No one could guess when that moment would come, or what would trigger it, or how deeply it would cut, but they all felt the tension rising, like a wire pulled tighter with every scene. And Barbra, with all her intuition, all her sensitivity, all her unfiltered emotional honesty, seemed to be the person unknowingly walking Redford toward that breaking point. A breaking point that would come in the final scene. In an embrace. In a whisper. In 6 words that would change everything. What, then, in that last moment, finally made Robert Redford shatter. The day they filmed the final scene of The Way We Were, something felt different on set. It wasn't the usual quiet professionalism. It was a deeper silence, the kind that gathers before a storm or a confession. Everyone moved carefully, as if afraid that even the smallest sound might disturb the fragile tension surrounding Robert Redford. Sidney Pollock walked across the set with his worn, note-filled script in hand. He checked the blocking one last time. Barbra walks up, brushes a strand of hair from Redford's forehead. He smiles softly. They speak their final words, accept what cannot be changed, and walk away. On paper, it was simple. On film, it was meant to be tender. But Pollock knew tenderness can be the most dangerous place for a man who has spent 14 years avoiding his own heart. Barbra stood a few feet away, watching Redford with an intensity she couldn't explain. He stood alone, hands in the pockets of his coat, staring at the ground. At first glance he seemed calm. He always did, but the calmness looked brittle, like a surface that might crack under its own weight. Pollock approached him gently. "Bob, you all right?" he asked. Redford nodded. "I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. Everyone could see that. His shoulders were too stiff. His breath slightly off rhythm. Even the way he held his jaw wasn't the same. It was the look of a man who feared that if he exhaled too deeply, everything inside him would spill out. "Let's rehearse once," Pollock said quietly. The rehearsal began like any other scene. Barbra stepped into her mark. The lights softened. The crew watched from behind monitors. Redford lifted his head, and in that instant, Barbra felt something shift, something she couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. It wasn't Hubble looking at Katie. It was Redford looking at Streisand. Not as an actor, not as a co-star, but as a man standing on the edge of a truth he could no longer outrun. They moved into the final embrace, the one that was supposed to be measured and brief. But Redford pulled her closer, tighter than the scene required. Tight enough for Barbra to lose her breath for a moment. Tight enough for her to feel his body shaking. Not from cold, not from nerves, but from something breaking open. And then, in a whisper so soft only she could hear, he said 6 words. "You remind me of Scott." Barbra froze. The words didn't belong to the script. They didn't belong to Hubble. They came from somewhere else, somewhere far deeper. She stepped back slightly and looked into his eyes. What she saw there wasn't confusion or embarrassment. It was grief, raw, unguarded, rising like water through cracks in a wall. "Who is Scott?" she asked softly. And that was the moment it happened. Redford broke. Not with theatrics. Not with the practiced intensity actors use when performing heartbreak, but with a collapse so quiet, so human, that the entire set seemed to stop breathing. His face crumpled. His eyes filled instantly. His body began to shake, not in small tremors, but in full, helpless waves. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Only a fractured sound, like something tearing loose inside him after being held too tightly for too long. Barbra stood there, stunned, watching a man the world believed to be unbreakable fall apart inches from her. But instinct took over. She wrapped her arms around him, not as Katie, not for the scene, not for the camera, but as a human being holding another human being who had carried too much, too silently. Redford buried his face in her shoulder and cried. Really cried. For the first time since 1959. Barbra's own tears followed, though she still didn't know who Scott was. She cried because she could feel the weight of the grief pouring out of him. Grief so old, so deep, it seemed to shake the air around them. The crew stood frozen. No one spoke. No one moved. The cameraman looked at Pollock, unsure if he should keep rolling or stop entirely. Pollock raised a hand for him to cut, but Pollock himself didn't step forward. He just watched, eyes red, as 2 of Hollywood's biggest stars clung to each other, not as performers, but as people. After long minutes, 5, maybe more, they finally loosened their embrace. Their faces were swollen, wet, streaked with ruined makeup. Neither spoke. Neither could. Pollock approached gently. "Bob, do you want to stop for the day? We can shoot this tomorrow." Redford shook his head, voice ragged, barely audible. "No, we shoot now. Before I lose it." Pollock turned to Streisand. She wiped her cheeks and nodded. "I'm ready," she said. And she was, because now she understood. She didn't know the story, but she knew the truth. The goodbye she was about to film wasn't fictional anymore. It was a doorway into something Redford had locked away for 14 years. Pollock sent the crew on a short break. Barbra and Redford stood apart, facing away from each other, trying to steady their breathing, trying to build just enough composure to stand in front of the camera again. But when they returned, the atmosphere had changed. Completely. The camera rolled. Redford lifted his eyes. Barbra stepped into the frame. What happened next wasn't acting, couldn't be acting. Redford wasn't Hubble saying goodbye to Katie. He was a father, finally saying a goodbye he never got to say. And Barbra, responding to the truth radiating from him, wasn't Katie anymore. She was a witness to a wound opening, and an anchor holding him steady. The scene that unfolded was deeper, fuller, more devastating than anything Pollock had rehearsed. Every breath carried weight. Every glance trembled with meaning. Every pause was filled with 14 years of unshed tears. When Pollock finally whispered, "Cut," the entire crew cried. Not a few tears, full, unguarded weeping. No one applauded. No one spoke. Silence settled again, but this time it felt reverent. Because they all understood. They had just watched a man break open. And in breaking, he had given cinema something real, something rare. A moment no technique could create. A moment no actor could fake. A moment when truth overwhelmed performance and transformed the way we were into a masterpiece born from the ashes of a long-buried grief. When Pollock called action for the official take, the atmosphere on set shifted. It was no longer the quiet of concentration. It was the quiet of reverence. A kind of stillness that settles when everyone senses they are about to witness something rare, something fragile, something real. Redford lifted his eyes. Barbra stepped into the frame. And what followed belonged to neither actor, nor script, nor camera. The moment their eyes met, they both understood, instinctively, that they were no longer playing Hubble and Katie. The embrace in rehearsal had opened a door Redford had kept locked for 14 years, and now, standing beneath the lights, he could not close it again. Barbra began her first line with a softness that wasn't in the screenplay. A quiet, trembling kindness. She wasn't speaking as Katie now. She was speaking as a woman who had glimpsed the raw wound behind a man's carefully constructed composure. She knew something about him that she hadn't known an hour earlier, and she carried that truth into every syllable. Redford answered not with technique, but with breath, heavy, unsteady, edged with grief. A breath that revealed more than any line could. It was the breath of a father remembering the weight of a child he lost too soon. A breath of surrender, not performance. When Barbra lifted her hand to smooth his hair, Redford closed his eyes. Not because the script required it, but because the gesture triggered a memory he could not control. A tiny hand, so small it barely wrapped around his thumb, holding on as if the world depended on it. Barbra saw his eyelids tremble. She understood. She asked no questions. She only let her fingers rest there a moment longer. Each pause, each glance, each breath carried the thrum of a truth electric in the air. And the camera captured all of it, quietly, respectfully, as if it too knew better than to interfere. When they reached the final beat, the moment Katie gently brushes Hubble's hair and accepts that love is not always enough, Redford didn't deliver heartbreak. He lived it. He wasn't saying goodbye as Hubble. He was saying the goodbye he never got to give in 1959. Barbra felt the shift instantly. Her own eyes filled, not because the scene demanded tears, but because Redford's pain radiated outward like a tide. She was no longer acting opposite him. She was witnessing a man allow the truth to surface for the first time in 14 years. And when Redford stepped out of the frame, completing the scene's final gesture, the entire set seemed to exhale. Pollack whispered, "Cut." Silence. Not a single person moved. Not a single person spoke. It felt almost intrusive to even breathe. Then, one by one, the crew began to cry. The camera operator set his rig down and wiped his face. A lighting technician turned away, shoulders shaking. Even the younger crew members, those too new to fully grasp what they had just seen, felt something deep and unfamiliar press against their chests. Pollack stared at Redford, his own eyes glassy. Finally, he said quietly, almost to himself, "That wasn't acting." When the film was released, the public had no idea what had happened that day. They didn't know about the whisper. They didn't know about the rehearsal that broke him open. They didn't know about the 6 words that had pulled 14 years of silence to the surface. All they knew was that the final scene struck something inside them that they couldn't articulate. In New York, audiences cried openly in the dark. In Los Angeles, moviegoers walked out of theaters in stunned silence. In Chicago, a critic wrote, "I do not know what I just saw, but I know it was true." One reviewer called it one of the most emotionally honest farewells ever captured on film. But no one, not the critics, not the audiences, not even the studio, knew the real reason the scene felt so painfully, unmistakably authentic. Only the crew knew. Only those 50 people on set that day understood why the air had felt heavy. Only they knew the name Scott. Only they knew that Redford's final glance wasn't a performance. It was a wound opening. They carried that secret quietly for years, out of respect, out of awe, out of something almost sacred. Looking back, one crew member would later say, "I was there the day truth stepped in front of the camera." And maybe that's why the scene became legend. Not because the acting was perfect, not because the screenplay demanded brilliance, but because, for one extraordinary moment, the boundary between fiction and truth disappeared. Cinema captured something human, uncontrolled, unplanned, unrepeatable. A moment born from a heart that had stayed silent for too long, and finally dared to speak. When the way we were wrapped filming, something in Robert Redford had changed, subtly, quietly, but unmistakably. Those who had known him for years couldn't quite describe it. He wasn't happier. He wasn't lighter in the way people become after good news. But there was a softness in the way he carried himself, a gentleness in the way he listened, as if the weight he had spent 14 years holding had shifted, even if only slightly, to a place where he could finally breathe around it. No one dared bring up the final scene. No one mentioned the whisper. No one said Scott's name. But the crew moved around Redford differently in the days that followed, with a kind of careful respect, the way one behaves after witnessing someone break and rebuild in real time. Barbra Streisand, too, seemed changed. In interviews she would give years later, whenever the film was mentioned, her eyes would soften, just slightly, and she would speak of Redford the same way one speaks of a private memory they're not sure they should share. "Bob gave everything in that scene," she once said, "more than anyone had the right to ask." And when journalists pressed, "What do you mean? What happened that day?" she would simply shake her head. "That's his story to tell, not mine." She protected that moment the same way Pollock did, and the same way every crew member did, by refusing to let it become gossip. They all understood that what happened on that set had nothing to do with Hollywood, fame, or filmmaking. It belonged to the private history of one man, and to the rare, fragile instant in which another human being held space for him without judgment. Redford never publicly explained the breakdown, the whisper, or the tears that soaked through Barbara's shoulder. He carried the memory the way he carried his grief, quietly, inwardly, without spectacle. But those who worked with him afterward noticed that something within him had loosened. Some internal tension had eased. His laugh came a fraction quicker. His silences felt less heavy, as if experiencing that moment, allowing himself to break, even for a handful of minutes, had released a pressure that had been building since 1959. It didn't erase the pain. It didn't bring Scott back. But it allowed Redford, for the first time, to stop running. When the film premiered, audiences wept at the final scene, unaware of the truth living inside it. They believed they were watching two great actors performing heartbreak. They didn't know they were watching heartbreak itself, raw, unfiltered, unplanned. Critics praised the ending as one of cinema's most authentic expressions of love and loss. Some described the moment Katie brushes Hubbell's hair as a farewell that feels stolen from real life. They were right. And wrong. It wasn't stolen. It was given, unintentionally, painfully, beautifully, by a man who had carried a goodbye in his chest for far too long. For decades, people returned to that scene without knowing why it struck them so deeply, why the silence felt so heavy, why the simple gesture of two people standing inches apart could make a throat tighten. The world felt the truth without knowing the source of it. And maybe that is the quiet power of art at its highest form. Not to imitate life, not to decorate it, but to reveal something human that words alone cannot reach. In 1973, for one brief moment, acting became reality. Fiction became memory. A performance became a confession. And Barbra Streisand, standing before Robert Redford, recognized that she wasn't filming a movie anymore. She was witnessing a man finally letting go of a grief too big to keep hidden, a grief that had shaped him in silence. The goodbye between Katie and Hubbell became immortal because it wasn't theirs. It belonged to a father and a son. To a promise whispered in the dark. To a love interrupted too soon. To 6 words that opened a door no one knew existed. And in the half-century since, people still watch the scene and cry, not because of the script, or the music, or the lighting, but because truth, when it finally breaks free, always finds its way into the hearts of those who recognize it. A reminder that even the strongest among us carry invisible wounds. And sometimes, all it takes is a single moment, a whisper, an embrace, a shared silence, for a human soul to finally set its sorrow down.